September 14th, 1978. 6:43 a.m. Alexandria, Virginia. The coffee pot burped its final sputter as Margaret Keller stood at her kitchen window, watching frost melt from the chain-link fence that separated her backyard from the Hoffmans' property. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees overnight, unusual for mid-September, and she could see her breath fogging the glass. Next door, the Hoffmans' garage door stood open. Had been open since she'd woken at 5:30. No car inside. Just darkness and what looked like tire tracks leading out to the alley, still wet from the previous night's rain. She pressed her palm against the window. Cold. Everything felt cold this morning. Richard Hoffman had lived next door for 3 years. Quiet man, late 40s, spoke with a slight accent he claimed was from Minnesota. His wife visited occasionally. At least, Margaret assumed it was his wife. A blonde woman in her 30s who never made eye contact at the mailbox. The Hoffmans kept their curtains drawn. They mowed their lawn at odd hours. Last Tuesday, Margaret had seen Richard carrying what looked like radio equipment into his basement at 2 in the morning. When she'd mentioned it to her husband Tom over breakfast, he'd laughed. Probably a ham radio enthusiast, he'd said. Let the man have his hobbies. But this morning, something felt wrong. The garage door hadn't been left open by accident. The house had no lights on, but Margaret could have sworn she'd heard voices, male voices, speaking rapidly in a language that wasn't English, around 4 a.m. She'd convinced herself it was a dream until she saw the garage. Her 13-year-old daughter, Amy, shuffled into the kitchen, still in her nightgown, and reached for the orange juice. "Mom, why are you staring at Mr. Hoffman's house?" Margaret didn't answer. She was watching a dark blue sedan pull into the Hoffmans' driveway. 2 men emerged, both wearing suits despite the early hour. They didn't knock. One of them produced a key and opened the front door. They disappeared inside. Tom appeared behind her, already dressed for his job at the Pentagon, his security badge clipped to his belt. He followed her gaze. "What's going on?" Margaret pointed to the sedan. Virginia plates, but something about it looked official. "Those aren't friends," she said quietly. Tom moved closer to the window. His face changed. She'd been married to him for 15 years and knew that expression, the one that meant his engineering mind was calculating trajectories and probabilities. "That's a government vehicle," he said. "I've seen those plates before." Amy pressed between them, orange juice forgotten. "Is Mr. Hoffman in trouble?" Neither parent answered. They were both watching the house now. The house where Richard Hoffman had lived for 3 years. Where he'd borrowed their lawnmower twice and returned it cleaned. Where he'd signed for their packages when they were away. Where he'd been such a perfectly unremarkable neighbor that Margaret realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, she couldn't remember a single meaningful conversation she'd ever had with him. The front door opened again. The 2 men emerged, and between them walked Richard Hoffman. No handcuffs, but his hands were behind his back. His face looked gray in the early morning light. As they guided him toward the sedan, he turned his head and looked directly at the Keller house. For 3 seconds, his eyes met Margaret's through the kitchen window. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been caught, but wasn't particularly concerned about the consequences. The smile of someone who'd already won something nobody else knew about yet. Tom grabbed the phone. Margaret heard him dialing. Heard him ask for someone named Colonel Patterson. Amy stood frozen with the refrigerator door still open, cold air spilling into the kitchen. The sedan backed out of the driveway, turned onto the street, and disappeared toward Route 1. In the sudden silence, Margaret noticed something she hadn't seen before. The Hoffmans' mailbox flag was up. Richard Hoffman never got mail. What the Keller family had witnessed was the culmination of a 4-year FBI counterintelligence operation that would eventually expose one of the most sophisticated KGB networks ever established on American soil. The house at 847 Oakwood Terrace wasn't just a residence. It was a safe house, a communications hub, and a training facility for Soviet intelligence officers conducting operations throughout the Washington metropolitan area. Richard Hoffman wasn't his real name. He was Colonel Dmitry Polyakov, not the famous GRU officer who spied for the Americans, but a different Polyakov entirely, a KGB signals intelligence specialist who had been living under deep cover since 1975. But in September 1978, almost nobody knew this yet. Not the FBI agents who arrested him. Not the neighbors who'd lived beside him. Not even the CIA officers who would spend the next 6 months trying to understand the full scope of what had been operating in a quiet suburb less than 8 miles from the White House. The official story, released to the press 3 days after the arrest, was carefully sanitized. The Justice Department announced that federal agents had apprehended a foreign national suspected of violating communications laws. No mention of espionage. No mention of the Soviet Union. The Washington Post ran a 4-paragraph story on page 12. Neighbors were told there had been a misunderstanding about permits for radio equipment. The Keller family received a visit from 2 FBI agents who politely asked them to refrain from discussing what they'd seen. National security matter. Routine precaution. Nothing to worry about. Margaret Keller didn't believe a word of it. The way Richard Hoffman had smiled at her, that wasn't the face of someone arrested for permit violations. That was the face of a man who'd spent years perfecting a lie and had been caught, but somehow remained in control. She started keeping a journal, writing down everything she remembered about the Hoffmans. The visitors who came at odd hours. The van with Maryland plates that delivered boxes every other Tuesday. The fact that the Hoffmans' trash cans were always suspiciously light, as if they burned most of their garbage. The time she'd seen Richard on his roof, adjusting what looked like a television antenna, but was pointed in the wrong direction. Not toward the broadcast towers in Washington, but southeast, toward the Potomac River. Tom Keller, with his Pentagon security clearance and his network of colleagues who worked in signals intelligence, started asking questions. Discreetly at first, then more urgently when he realized how many people were suddenly interested in his inquiries. Within a week, his office received a memorandum reminding him of his non-disclosure obligations. Within 2 weeks, he was called into a meeting with a Defense Intelligence Agency officer who explained, very carefully, that his curiosity could jeopardize ongoing investigations. But by then, Tom had already pieced together enough fragments to understand that something significant had been happening next door. He'd learned that the FBI had been surveilling the Hoffmans' house for 9 months before the arrest. He'd discovered that radio signals had been detected emanating from the property, signals that matched known Soviet communication protocols. He'd heard rumors, impossible to verify, that the Hoffmans' basement contained encryption equipment sophisticated enough to send coded messages directly to Moscow without relying on vulnerable embassy communications. What the Kellers didn't know, what almost nobody outside a classified briefing room at FBI headquarters knew, was that the Safehouse at 847 Oakwood Terrace had been operational since 1975 and had been used to support at least 17 different Soviet intelligence operations in the Washington area. The FBI had identified it in late 1977, thanks to a defector named Arkady Shevchenko, who had provided enough information to narrow the search to a specific neighborhood, but hadn't known the exact address. For 9 months, FBI counterintelligence specialists had run what they called Operation Neighbor Watch, monitoring 6 different houses in Alexandria that matched Shevchenko's descriptions. They'd installed listening devices in street lamps. They'd recruited mail carriers to photograph envelope addresses. They'd placed agents in nearby homes, posing as residents, watching and waiting. The house next to the Kellers had emerged as the prime suspect in June 1978, when surveillance detected a radio transmission that included a numeric code matching KGB communication protocols used for agent handling. But the FBI wanted to observe longer, to identify everyone who visited the Safehouse, to map the entire network before making arrests. They'd planned to wait until November, when they expected a senior KGB officer to visit from the Soviet embassy. Then something went wrong. On September 13th, 1978, one day before the Kellers watched Richard Hoffman being arrested, a CIA officer named David Barnett was scheduled to meet his KGB handler at a location in Northern Virginia. Barnett had been spying for the Soviets since 1976, providing classified information about CIA operations in Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. His handler was supposed to be a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy, but surveillance indicated the meeting location had changed at the last minute. The new location was described in Barnett's instructions as the safe location we discussed, Arlington Sector. The FBI, monitoring Barnett as part of an ongoing investigation that would eventually lead to his arrest in 1980, realized with sudden alarm that Arlington Sector might mean the Alexandria Safehouse. If Barnett was directed to 847 Oakwood Terrace, the entire operation would be exposed. A CIA officer showing up at a supposedly covert KGB facility would force the Soviets to shut down the Safehouse immediately, destroying evidence and scattering their network before the FBI could identify all participants. The decision was made quickly. On September 14th at 6:15 a.m., 28 minutes before Margaret Keller stood at her kitchen window, FBI agents moved in to secure the property before Barnett's scheduled arrival. They had arrest warrants for Richard Hoffman and his wife Elena, who turned out to be a signals intelligence technician, not his spouse. They had search warrants for the property. They had authorization to seize any equipment, documents, or materials related to espionage activities. What they found in the basement of 847 Oakwood Terrace would reshape American understanding of how the KGB operated on U.S. soil. The house itself was unremarkable from the outside. A split-level colonial built in 1968, with aluminum siding painted pale yellow and shutters that needed replacing. Inside, the ground floor maintained the appearance of normal suburban living. Furniture from Sears, a television that actually worked, a refrigerator stocked with ordinary American food, Wonder Bread, Kraft cheese, Miller Lite beer, photographs on the mantle showing Richard and Elena at various tourist locations, the Grand Canyon, Niagara Falls, Colonial Williamsburg. The FBI would later determine these photographs were authentic. The KGB had actually sent their officers on vacation to create believable documentation of an American lifestyle. But the basement revealed the truth. Behind a false wall, constructed to look like ordinary concrete foundation, FBI agents discovered a room approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, accessible only through a concealed door operated by pressing a specific sequence on what appeared to be an electrical panel. Inside this room was equipment that would have been impressive in a professional communications facility, let alone a suburban house. 3 radio transceivers, each capable of both receiving and transmitting signals across multiple frequency bands. One of them, an R350M, was standard issue for Soviet military intelligence and had been modified to increase its range and encryption capabilities. 2 shortwave receivers were tuned to specific frequencies used by number stations, radio broadcasts consisting of spoken numbers or Morse code that served as one-way communication channels for intelligence agencies. The FBI recognized these immediately. The agency had been monitoring Soviet number stations for years, but finding receiving equipment in an American residential neighborhood confirmed that the KGB was actively using this method to communicate with agents on U.S. soil. More significantly, they found encryption equipment. A modified version of the Fialka cipher machine, a Soviet electromechanical device used to encrypt and decrypt messages, was positioned on a workbench surrounded by technical manuals written in Russian. The machine itself was evidence of sophisticated tradecraft. Fialka machines were supposed to be confined to Soviet diplomatic facilities where they could be destroyed in case of emergency. Having one in an unprotected suburban location violated standard KGB security protocols, unless the operation was important enough to justify the risk. The technical specifications were damning. The R350M transceiver could transmit encrypted messages directly to receiving stations in Cuba or Soviet fishing vessels in international waters off the Atlantic coast. Range estimates suggested it could reach approximately 1,800 miles under optimal atmospheric conditions. This meant the Safehouse could communicate with Moscow without routing signals through the Soviet embassy in Washington, bypassing known surveillance of diplomatic facilities. It was a communications backdoor that the FBI and NSA hadn't fully anticipated. Equally revealing were the documents. Stored in a fireproof safe behind the false wall, FBI agents recovered 347 pages of materials that would take months to analyze fully. These included codebooks for converting plain text into numeric codes, maps of Washington, D.C., with specific locations marked: the Pentagon, CIA headquarters in Langley, the State Department, various defense contractor facilities in Northern Virginia, lists of names, some of which matched known Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, others that appeared to be American citizens. The FBI would spend years investigating those names, trying to determine if they represented recruited agents, surveillance targets, or simply people the KGB had identified as potentially useful. One document, labeled in Russian as Contact Protocol 7B, outlined procedures for meetings between KGB officers and agents in the field. It specified that certain high-value agents, those with access to sensitive information and high risk of surveillance, should avoid the Soviet embassy entirely and instead use the Alexandria Safehouse for emergency communications. The protocol described how agents would signal their need for contact by placing specific advertisements in the classified sections of Washington area newspapers. The KGB officer at the Safehouse would monitor these advertisements daily and respond by placing a coded message in the dead drop locations listed in the protocol. This explained something that had puzzled the FBI for months. They'd been intercepting suspicious classified advertisements: oak desk, excellent condition, must sell by Tuesday, that seemed to have no legitimate buyer or seller. Agents posing as interested purchasers would call the listed phone numbers and find disconnected lines or people who claimed to know nothing about any advertisement. The FBI had suspected these were covert communications, but hadn't been able to prove it. Now, in the basement of the Hoffman's house, they found the newspaper clippings, carefully cut out and filed with dates and corresponding notes in Russian. Agent Cardinal confirmed contact needed. Agent Bishop meeting postponed. Agent Rook emergency signal, protocol active. The code names alone were intelligence gold. Cardinal, Bishop, Rook. These suggested a chess metaphor that appealed to the Soviet mind. But more importantly, they indicated multiple active agents operating in the Washington area. The FBI would spend the next 18 months attempting to identify who these codenames represented. Some they never found. Cardinal remained unidentified until 1985, when a different Soviet defector provided information suggesting the codename referred to a mid-level NSA employee who had been providing technical information about American signals intelligence capabilities. That employee had died in a car accident in 1981, and whether the accident was genuine or whether Moscow had eliminated a potentially compromising asset remained an open question. The human dimension of the Safehouse was equally striking. Richard Hoffman, whose real name was Dmitry Polyakov, though he was not the famous Soviet general who spied for America, had been trained specifically for deep cover operations in the United States. His KGB file, portions of which would eventually be obtained through other sources, revealed that he had spent 2 years preparing for his role. He'd studied American culture, practiced Midwestern accents, learned to appreciate baseball, and complain about taxes. The KGB had created an entire false identity, complete with fabricated childhood records from Minnesota, a fake employment history, and carefully constructed references that would withstand casual investigation. Elena Polyakov, whose cover name was Elena Hoffman, had undergone similar training. Her specialization was signals intelligence and cryptography. She'd been educated at a technical institute in Leningrad and had worked for the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, before being transferred to the KGB's first Chief Directorate for Foreign Operations. Together, the Polyakovs represented a significant investment by Moscow. 2 highly trained officers, dedicated to a single Safehouse operation, living under constant stress of potential discovery, all to maintain a covert communications channel that bypassed normal diplomatic protocols. The stress was evident in what the FBI found upstairs. In the bedroom, hidden in a locked drawer beneath folded clothing, was a flask of vodka and prescription medication for anxiety. Elena's personal effects included letters written in Russian but never sent, letters addressed to her mother in Leningrad, describing loneliness and fear, complaining about the constant vigilance required to maintain her cover identity. "I smile at the neighbors," she'd written in one letter dated August 1978, "and inside I am screaming. How much longer must we do this?" Dmitri says perhaps 2 more years. "I don't know if I can last 2 more years pretending to care about lawn fertilizer and whether the Johnson's son got into a good college." These letters were never meant to be seen by American intelligence. They revealed the human cost of espionage, the psychological toll of living a lie year after year. But they also revealed operational details. Elena mentioned that they'd recently received new encryption protocols. The codes changed again. More complex now. It takes me twice as long to process messages. She referred to someone called the Center, which FBI analysts recognized as KGB slang for Moscow headquarters. She described a visit from the Colonel, who had been angry about the close call last month, suggesting that the Safehouse had nearly been compromised before September 1978. That close call worried FBI investigators. What had nearly gone wrong? Reviewing surveillance logs from earlier months, they found an incident in August when a telephone repair truck had parked outside the Hoffman's house for several hours. The truck was legitimate. There had been phone line problems in the neighborhood, but the Polyakovs had apparently suspected surveillance. They'd shut down all radio operations for 3 days, burned documents in their fireplace despite the August heat, and contacted the Soviet embassy using a payphone rather than their usual covert channels. The KGB officer who visited, the Colonel, from Elena's letter, had assessed the situation and concluded it was genuine coincidence, not FBI surveillance. Operations resumed, but the Polyakovs had been rattled. Dmitri had written his own notes, found by FBI agents in a notebook disguised as a household repair log. In careful Russian script, he documented his fears. "We are too exposed. The Americans have technical capabilities we don't fully understand. Every transmission is a risk. I recommended to the center that we reduce frequency of operations, but they insist the agents need regular contact. Bishop is particularly demanding, wants weekly meetings. I explained weekly is impossible, but center supports him. He must be very valuable." Bishop was very valuable. The FBI's counterintelligence division had been trying to identify a leak inside the Pentagon for 18 months. Someone providing detailed information about NATO defense planning and U.S. nuclear strategy. Documents found in the Safehouse suggested Bishop had access to material classified as top secret, with special compartmented information handling restrictions. This meant Bishop worked in a very limited pool of people. Probably fewer than 200 individuals across the entire Department of Defense had access to the specific programs mentioned in the documents. The FBI began a discreet investigation, looking for Pentagon employees who fit the profile. Someone with appropriate security clearances. Someone who'd been in position since at least 1976. Someone with access to NATO planning documents and nuclear strategy assessments. Someone who might have had reason to be in Northern Virginia on the dates when Bishop meetings were documented in the Safehouse records. They never found him. Or they found him, but couldn't prove it. The files on Bishop remain officially classified, but retired FBI agents who worked the case have occasionally hinted in interviews that they identified a suspect, but lacked sufficient evidence to prosecute. The suspect died in 1989, and the investigation was closed without charges. Whether Bishop was guilty, whether he even knew he was providing information that ended up in Soviet hands, whether the entire Bishop operation was a sophisticated false flag to mislead American counterintelligence, these questions remain unanswered. What became clear during the investigation was how the Safehouse had functioned operationally. The Polyakovs didn't meet agents face-to-face at the house. That would have been too risky. Instead, they served as a communications relay. Agents would place coded messages in dead drops, hollow tree stumps, spaces behind loose bricks in public buildings, magnetic containers attached underneath park benches. The Polyakovs would retrieve these messages, usually at night, and transmit the information to Moscow using their radio equipment. Moscow would send responses through number stations or encrypted radio transmissions that the Polyakovs would receive, decode, and place in separate dead drops for the agents to retrieve. This system provided security through compartmentalization. If an agent was arrested, he couldn't identify his KGB handlers because he'd never met them face-to-face. If a dead drop was compromised, it couldn't lead investigators to the Safehouse because there was no direct connection. Only someone who understood the entire system, someone like a defector with detailed knowledge of KGB operations, could identify the link between dead drops, agents, and the Safehouse. That defector was Arkady Shevchenko, who had served as Undersecretary General at the United Nations while secretly cooperating with the CIA. Shevchenko had defected in April 1978, and his debriefing had provided the initial information that led the FBI to focus on Alexandria. But Shevchenko's knowledge was limited. He'd heard about a Safehouse, knew it was in the Virginia suburbs, knew it was used for handling valuable agents, but didn't know the exact address or the names of the officers running it. The FBI had to do the detective work, narrowing the search through technical surveillance, pattern analysis, and patient observation. The irony was that the Keller family, completely unaware they were living next to a KGB operation, had observed details that should have raised alarms years earlier. Margaret Keller's journal, which she eventually shared with FBI agents, documented odd patterns that in retrospect seemed obvious. The Hoffmans never had visitors on weekends, only on Tuesday and Thursday evenings between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. Richard Hoffman's car would leave the garage on these evenings around 8:30 p.m. and return around midnight, but the car never seemed dirty, as if he wasn't driving long distances. Once, Margaret had seen him wearing gloves despite warm weather. Exactly the kind of detail that suggested he was avoiding leaving fingerprints on materials he was handling. Tom Keller, with his technical background, had noticed the antenna issue. The Hoffmans' television antenna was positioned at an angle that made no sense for receiving broadcast signals from Washington stations. It was pointing southeast toward the Atlantic Ocean, which would be the correct orientation for receiving shortwave signals from distant transmitters. Tom had actually mentioned this to a colleague at work, a signals intelligence specialist, who dismissed it as probably just poor installation by a contractor who didn't know what he was doing. These observations, individually meaningless, formed a pattern when examined collectively. The FBI's post-arrest analysis concluded that ordinary citizens had been inadvertently conducting surveillance on a Soviet intelligence operation for 3 years without realizing it. This led to an internal discussion about whether the Bureau should do more to educate the public about indicators of espionage activity. Should citizens be told what to look for? Or would that simply make Soviet officers more careful and sophisticated in their tradecraft? The debate was never fully resolved, but the FBI did implement Operation Neighborhood Watch as a formal program in 1979, training local police departments in Virginia and Maryland to recognize unusual patterns that might indicate intelligence activity. Antennas pointed in wrong directions, visitors at odd hours, minimal trash production suggesting materials were being burned, residents who seemed to have no normal social connections, despite living in a neighborhood for years. It was counterintelligence. Through community awareness, an attempt to turn American suburbs into a passive surveillance network. The Polyakovs, meanwhile, faced their own reckoning. After their arrest on September 14, 1978, they were held in federal detention. While prosecutors prepared espionage charges, the case seemed straightforward. American agents had caught Soviet intelligence officers operating illegally on U.S. soil, with clear evidence of espionage activities. But the legal process became complicated. First problem: Prosecuting the Polyakovs would require revealing in open court exactly what the FBI had found in the Safehouse, which would expose American counterintelligence capabilities and potentially compromise ongoing investigations into Bishop, Cardinal, and other unidentified agents. Second problem, the Polyakovs had diplomatic passports issued by the Soviet Union, which their lawyers claimed provided immunity from prosecution. The State Department disputed this. The Polyakovs had been operating under false identities, not as declared diplomats. But the legal argument created delays. Third problem, the most serious. Moscow wanted them back. The Soviets began applying diplomatic pressure, suggesting that continued detention of the Polyakovs could jeopardize ongoing arms control negotiations. SALT II talks were at a critical stage. The Carter administration was trying to improve relations with Moscow. Prosecuting two Soviet intelligence officers might derail these broader policy objectives. Behind closed doors, negotiations began. The CIA wanted to keep the Polyakovs in custody, believing they could be persuaded to defect and provide detailed information about KGB operations. The State Department wanted to resolve the situation quietly to avoid disrupting relations with Moscow. The FBI wanted public prosecutions to deter future Soviet intelligence activities. President Carter, briefed on the situation in late September, faced a decision that balanced intelligence value, diplomatic considerations, and domestic political concerns. The decision came in November 1978. The Polyakovs would be quietly deported in exchange for the release of an American businessman who'd been detained in Moscow on fraud charges. The businessman, an executive with an agricultural machinery company, had been held for 6 months on what U.S. officials considered fabricated evidence. His release would allow the administration to claim a victory, an innocent American brought home, while quietly resolving the embarrassing discovery of a KGB safehouse operating for 3 years without detection. The swap occurred on November 17, 1978, at Tempelhof Airport in West Berlin, using the same location where Cold War prisoner exchanges had been conducted since the 1950s. The Polyakovs were flown from Washington to Berlin on a military transport, accompanied by FBI agents and a State Department official. They crossed the tarmac at 3:15 p.m. local time, walking toward a Soviet aircraft, while the American businessman walked in the opposite direction. Photographers captured the moment, the last time the Polyakovs were seen by Western intelligence. But the story didn't end there. In the months following their return to Moscow, the CIA received fragmentary reports about the Polyakovs' fate. They'd been debriefed extensively by the KGB, required to account for their capture, and explain how much they'd revealed to American interrogators. The report suggested tensions. Moscow was suspicious about how quickly the FBI had located the safehouse, wondered whether the Polyakovs had been deliberately careless, or even whether they'd been compromised by a mole inside the KGB. Dmitry Polyakov disappeared from public view after 1979. Elena was seen occasionally at KGB social functions until 1981. Then she too vanished from Western intelligence reporting. Retired CIA officers have speculated that the Polyakovs were either quietly retired with a dacha in the countryside, sent to teach at KGB training facilities, or, in the darker scenarios, executed for operational security failures. The truth remains unknown, lost in the classified archives of Russia's intelligence services. For the Keller family, the aftermath was equally strange. After the FBI asked them to remain quiet about what they'd witnessed, Margaret and Tom found themselves isolated from their own experience. They couldn't discuss it with neighbors, who'd been told the Hoffmans had simply moved away. They couldn't talk about it with friends without violating the FBI's request for discretion. Their daughter Amy, 13 years old when she'd watched men in suits arrest their neighbor, grew up with a secret she couldn't share. The house at 847 Oakwood Terrace remained empty for 6 months. In the spring of 1979, it was purchased by an investment company that turned out to be a front for the CIA. The agency wanted to control the property, concerned that Soviet intelligence might attempt to retrieve materials they'd left behind, or conduct surveillance to determine how much the Americans had learned. CIA technicians went through the house methodically, looking for anything the FBI might have missed. They found 3 more concealed compartments, one behind the bathroom mirror, containing microfilm of documents that appeared to be copies of classified Pentagon materials, one beneath the garage floor, containing cash and small bills totaling $73,000, probably an emergency fund, and one in the attic, containing false identity documents, passports, driver's licenses, birth certificates. For at least 5 different cover identities, the Polyakovs could have assumed if they needed to disappear quickly. The discovery of these additional materials troubled counterintelligence analysts. If the Polyakovs had emergency identities prepared, it suggested they'd been planning for the possibility of exposure and escape. The fact that they didn't use these identities during their arrest meant either they'd been caught too quickly to implement their escape plan, or they'd deliberately chosen not to flee, perhaps believing they'd be exchanged for American prisoners. The second scenario suggested sophisticated calculation. The Polyakovs had understood the diplomatic and political context well enough to know their capture wouldn't result in long-term imprisonment. The cash was even more intriguing. $73,000 in 1979 represented significant resources, enough to support an entirely new identity for months or even years. Where had this money come from? The FBI traced serial numbers on some of the bills and determined they'd been issued by banks in Maryland and Virginia between 1976 and 1978. This suggested the Polyakovs had been carefully accumulating cash, probably from funds provided by Moscow through covert channels, preparing for potential emergencies. But why hadn't Moscow simply provided a single large payment? Why accumulate cash gradually? The answer revealed another layer of tradecraft. By acquiring cash slowly, in small amounts from multiple sources, the Polyakovs avoided creating suspicious patterns that might be detected by banking surveillance. Even in the 1970s, large cash transactions could trigger reporting requirements and law enforcement interest. But $500 here, $1,000 there, spread across different banks and different time periods. That was invisible, safe, professional. The KGB had learned from earlier operations that had been exposed through financial trails, and the Polyakovs' cash management demonstrated institutional learning and sophisticated operational security. Yet despite all this sophistication, they'd been caught. The Safehouse had been discovered. The network had been compromised. Why? The FBI's analysis concluded that the exposure resulted from a combination of factors, none sufficient by itself, but collectively fatal to the operation. First, Arkady Shevchenko's defection had provided the initial lead, narrowing the search to a specific geographic area. Second, technical surveillance capabilities had advanced. The FBI's ability to detect and analyze radio signals had improved significantly between 1975, when the Safehouse began operations, and 1978, when it was discovered. Third, the Polyakovs themselves had made small errors, the antenna positioning, the odd hours, the minimal social connections, that in isolation meant nothing but together created a pattern recognizable to trained observers. But there was a fourth factor, one that troubled counterintelligence professionals more deeply: the possibility of penetration. Had the KGB network been compromised from within? Was there a mole inside Soviet intelligence who'd provided information to the CIA or FBI? Several data points suggested this possibility. The FBI had known exactly when to raid the Safehouse, the morning before David Barnett's scheduled meeting, suggesting they'd had precise intelligence about KGB operational plans. The speed with which agents had located concealed compartments in the house suggested they'd known what to look for. The identification of specific code names like Bishop and Cardinal suggested access to information that couldn't have been deduced through external surveillance alone. These suspicions led to one of the most significant counterintelligence investigations of the late Cold War: the search for a Soviet source who'd provided information about the Alexandria Safehouse. That investigation would eventually intersect with other cases: the 1985 identification of Aldrich Ames as a Soviet mole inside the CIA, the ongoing suspicion of Robert Hansen inside the FBI. But in 1978 and 1979, it was a separate inquiry, focused specifically on who had betrayed the Polyakovs and their safehouse. The inquiry never reached a definitive conclusion. The CIA examined everyone who'd had access to information about the investigation. The FBI reviewed its own procedures, looking for security breaches. Multiple people were subjected to polygraph examinations. Several careers were derailed by suspicion, even without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. But no mole was identified. No source was confirmed. And the question of whether the safehouse was betrayed from within remained unanswered. What did become clear was how the discovery of the safehouse affected broader Cold War dynamics. When Moscow realized the Americans had found their covert communications channel, they had to assume that every operation supported through that channel was compromised. This triggered a cascade of operational security reviews across the entire Soviet intelligence apparatus in North America. Dead drops were changed. Codebooks were updated. Agents were contacted and warned to reduce their activities. Some were pulled out entirely, recalled to Moscow for debriefing and reassignment. The result was a temporary but significant degradation in Soviet intelligence collection capabilities in the United States. For approximately 18 months after September 1978, KGB operations in Washington were reduced by an estimated 40%, according to classified NSA assessments that tracked Soviet communication patterns. This reduction had strategic implications. During 1979, as the Carter administration negotiated the SALT II treaty and dealt with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Moscow's intelligence agencies were operating partially blind, still recovering from the exposure of the Alexandria Safehouse and its associated network. American policymakers didn't fully understand this advantage at the time. The intelligence community knew they'd disrupted Soviet operations, but the extent of the disruption and its strategic impact weren't clear until years later, when defectors and declassified documents provided retrospective insight. In the moment, what seemed like a significant tactical victory, catching the Polyakovs, shutting down a safehouse, had ripple effects that influenced Cold War dynamics at the highest levels. The impact extended to technology and tradecraft. The encryption equipment found in the safehouse, particularly the modified Fialka machine, gave American cryptographers valuable intelligence about Soviet communications security. They could analyze the machine's capabilities, understand its weaknesses, and potentially develop methods to decrypt Soviet communications that used similar equipment. The NSA, which had been working on breaking Soviet cipher systems for decades, gained insights that would inform their efforts for years to come. Similarly, the radio equipment provided technical intelligence about Soviet communications methods. The R350M transceiver's specifications, its frequency ranges, power output, modulation schemes, helped NSA analysts improve their ability to detect and locate similar equipment operating elsewhere. If there were other safehouses using comparable technology, the NSA now had a better chance of finding them through signals intelligence. The tradecraft insights were equally valuable. The FBI studied every aspect of how the Polyakovs had operated, their cover identities, their daily routines, their methods for meeting agents and transmitting intelligence. This knowledge informed counterintelligence training, helping FBI agents recognize indicators of covert operations. It influenced how the Bureau conducted surveillance, suggesting what patterns to look for when monitoring suspected intelligence officers. It even affected urban planning. Some security professionals began advocating for suburban neighborhood designs that would make it harder for foreign intelligence services to establish safehouses without being noticed by residents. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. The discovery of a KGB safehouse operating for 3 years in an ordinary American neighborhood, less than 8 miles from the White House, next door to a family with a father who worked at the Pentagon, shattered assumptions about how espionage worked. The popular imagination, shaped by spy novels and movies, tended to picture intelligence operations occurring in dark alleys and foreign embassies, not in suburban split-level houses with yellow siding and shutters that needed replacing. The Polyakov case demonstrated that the Cold War wasn't just happening in Berlin, or Moscow, or Vienna. It was happening in Alexandria, Virginia. It was happening next door. This realization had political implications. Congressional oversight committees demanded briefings about how a Soviet intelligence operation could function undetected for so long in American suburbia. Were there other safe houses? How many Soviet intelligence officers were operating under deep cover? What was being done to protect classified information from espionage? The questions led to increased budgets for counterintelligence, expanded FBI domestic surveillance authorities, and greater cooperation between intelligence agencies and local law enforcement. Some civil liberties advocates worried about these developments, warning that heightened security concerns could lead to excessive government surveillance of ordinary citizens. The debate played out in classified congressional sessions and in occasional public statements by officials who tried to balance security needs with constitutional protections. The tension was never fully resolved. It remains a fundamental challenge in democratic societies confronting espionage threats. But the Polyakov case became a reference point in these discussions, an example of the threats that justified enhanced security measures. For Margaret and Tom Keller, life gradually returned to something resembling normalcy, though they remained changed by the experience. Margaret's journal evolved from a record of observations about suspicious neighbors into a broader meditation on secrecy, trust, and the hidden dimensions of ordinary life. She wondered how many other secrets were concealed behind suburban facades, how many other families were living next to people who weren't what they seemed. The wondering never quite stopped. Tom Keller's career at the Pentagon continued, but he found himself more cautious about security, more aware of vulnerabilities. He'd lived next to a KGB operation without realizing it, which meant his own activities had been potentially observable by Soviet intelligence. Had they photographed him coming and going? Did they know where he worked? Had they considered trying to recruit him? These questions bothered him, though he had no evidence that the Polyakovs had taken any special interest in his Pentagon employment. Still, the possibility lingered. Amy Keller, 13 when the arrest happened, grew up with the memory of watching her neighbor smile at her mother through the kitchen window. Years later, in interviews she gave after the case was declassified, she described that smile as the moment she understood that people could be fundamentally different from what they appeared. "Mr. Hoffman seemed nice," she said. "He returned our lawnmower cleaned. He signed for packages. He was a good neighbor. And the whole time, he was a Soviet spy." That does something to you. You start wondering who people really are. The house at 847 Oakwood Terrace was eventually sold, legitimately this time, not as a CIA front, to a Navy captain and his family in 1983. The new owners were told nothing about its history. They lived there for 12 years, raised 2 children, and never knew they were sleeping in rooms where Soviet intelligence officers had once encrypted messages to Moscow. The basement was refinished, the false wall removed, the space converted into a recreation room with a pool table and a television. The radio equipment, the encryption machines, the hidden compartments, all of that was gone, replaced by ordinary suburban family life. But the story persisted in classified files and in the memories of people who'd been involved. FBI agents who'd participated in the investigation occasionally mentioned it in retirement, though always carefully, always respecting classification restrictions. CIA officers who'd analyzed the intelligence collected from the Safehouse included it in case studies used to train new counterintelligence specialists. The Polyakov Safehouse became a teaching example, a cautionary tale, a reminder that espionage was patient work requiring attention to small details and patterns that only revealed their significance over time. In Moscow, the case was also studied, though from a different perspective. KGB training programs examined what had gone wrong, how the Safehouse had been exposed, what mistakes had been made. The conclusion, according to defectors who later described these sessions, was that the operation had been too ambitious. 3 years was too long to maintain deep cover in a security-conscious environment like Washington. The technology was too sophisticated, and therefore too detectable. The network was too complex, and therefore too vulnerable to compromise. Future operations, the KGB determined, should be simpler, shorter duration, and rely more on human intelligence than technical collection methods. Whether this lesson was effectively learned is questionable. Throughout the 1980s, the FBI continued to discover Soviet intelligence operations in the United States, some using methods similar to the Polyakov Safehouse, others employing different tradecraft. The fundamental challenge remained unchanged. Intelligence agencies needed to collect information, and residential neighborhoods provided cover and access. The cat-and-mouse game continued. Then came 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The KGB was dissolved, its archives partially opened, its officers scattered into retirement, or reassigned to new Russian intelligence services. Some secrets emerged. Many remained buried. The Polyakov case files were never fully released, though fragments appeared in memoirs and in documents obtained by Western researchers. Dmitry and Elena Polyakov were never heard from again. Whether they lived out quiet retirements, whether they remained active in Russian intelligence under new identities, whether they'd been punished for their capture, none of this became known. What became known eventually was that the Alexandria Safehouse had been just one node in a much larger network. Declassified documents revealed that between 1975 and 1985, the KGB operated at least 11 similar safehouses in the United States, located in suburbs of Washington, New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Most were never discovered. Some may still exist, mothballed and waiting, maintained by intelligence services that learned from the Polyakov case, but never abandoned the fundamental strategy of establishing covert presence in American communities. This knowledge created a strange cognitive dissonance for Americans who learned about these operations. How does a free society defend itself against infiltration without becoming paranoid and closed? How do neighbors trust each other while remaining alert to potential threats? How do intelligence agencies protect national security without conducting surveillance so intrusive that it undermines the freedoms being protected? These questions, raised by the Polyakov case in 1978, remain relevant decades later, as new technologies and new threats create new variations on old challenges. The safe house itself, the physical building at 847 Oakwood Terrace, stands as an ordinary monument to extraordinary events. If you drive past it today, you see a well-maintained split-level colonial, indistinguishable from dozens of similar houses in the neighborhood. The current owners are unaware of its history. The story has faded from public memory, though it remains documented in classified archives and in the recollections of people who were there when it happened. The house has no historical marker, no indication that it was once a battleground in the Cold War's shadow conflict. But sometimes, former residents of the neighborhood walk past and remember. They remember when FBI agents arrived at dawn. They remember when the Hoffmans, or the Polyakovs, or whoever they really were, disappeared into federal custody and then vanished entirely from American consciousness. They remember the strange disquiet of realizing that espionage wasn't something that happened in distant places to other people. It happened here. It happened to them, though they didn't know it at the time. Margaret Keller, now in her 80s, still lives in the area. She has told the story to researchers and journalists, always carefully, always aware that some details remain classified. When asked what she learned from the experience, she pauses before answering. "I learned that we're all living closer to secrets than we think," she says. "That house next door, it looked like every other house. The people seemed ordinary, but underneath, there was this whole other reality, and we were part of it without knowing. That's what bothers me most. Not that they were spies, but that we were involved in something significant and didn't realize it for 3 years. What else don't we realize?" It's a question that resonates beyond the specifics of the Polyakov case. In any society, in any era, there are hidden dimensions that most people never see. Intelligence operations are just one example, but they're a vivid example, a dramatic illustration of how surfaces can deceive and how the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary. The Safehouse in Alexandria served that purpose for 3 years, concealing Soviet intelligence operations behind the facade of an ordinary suburban home, until the facade cracked and the truth emerged. Now, decades later, the truth has been partially documented, partially declassified, partially remembered, and largely forgotten by the general public. But it's there, in the archives, waiting for researchers and historians who want to understand how the Cold War was actually fought, not in grand geopolitical maneuvers, but in the mundane details of suburban neighborhoods where spies lived next door to Pentagon engineers, and nobody suspected anything was wrong until one cold September morning when federal agents arrived and the carefully constructed lie finally collapsed. The last piece of evidence removed from the house at 847 Oakwood Terrace was a small notebook found in the back of a kitchen drawer, overlooked during the initial search. An FBI agent discovered it months later during a final sweep before the property was turned over to the CIA. The notebook contained recipes, handwritten instructions for making borscht, pelmeni, blini, Russian dishes that Elena Polyakov had prepared in secret, probably late at night when the curtains were drawn and she could briefly stop pretending to be an American housewife. The recipes were written in Russian, in careful script, with small notations about ingredients that were hard to find in American stores and substitutions that could be used. At the bottom of one page, beneath a recipe for pierogi, Elena had written a single sentence: "Someday we will go home and I will make these properly, with ingredients that taste the way they should, and I will not have to pretend anymore." She never got to make them properly. The notebook sits in a classified archive now, evidence in a case that's been closed for decades. But those words remain, a small human detail in the bureaucratic record of espionage and counterintelligence. A reminder that the people involved in these operations, on both sides, were human beings living with fear and loneliness and the constant weight of deception. They played their roles in the Cold War's shadow conflicts. And when it was over, when they'd been caught or had escaped, or had simply aged out of active service, all that remained were the documents and the memories, and the unanswered questions about what it all meant. The notebook is still classified. The recipes are still secret. And somewhere, perhaps, Elena Polyakov, if she's still alive, remembers standing in that kitchen in Alexandria, preparing Russian dishes in an American house, pretending to be someone she wasn't, and dreaming of the day when she could stop pretending and go home.